It's now important that we recognize, as apologists, especially when we talk to the culture at large, we have to speak from the church to the culture. So there's that neutral ground thing. There's no neutral ground. We are speaking from the church to the culture. We are absolutely not speaking from the culture to the church. The culture's lens is warped. Its categories are all wrong. Are we saying this in a discriminatory, insulting fashion? No. We are just being intellectually honest about the fact that we are Christians, and therefore we believe the Christian vision of reality structures the way we see the world. Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, I want to talk to you today about moving to an offensive position, but we'll have to be very in our apologetics, in our cultural apologetics, but we'll want
Cameron's going to start using offensive language. Warning.
Correct. We'll want to be very clear, of course, on what we mean by all of our terms. But if I may, I'd like to set this up. And I'm drawing my thinking here from a lecture I've put together that I'll be giving in Annapolis soon for the C.S. Lewis Institute. So, all of our listeners have to suffer through this now. But I think this speaks to our moment. And my hope is also that this is going to be very practical for us as we think about the conversations we have with our neighbors and people in our lives when difficult questions come up. So let me begin on a note of disagreement. So there's a book that's worth your time, by the way. It's a valuable book, and some of you will be familiar with it and may have read it. This is Paul Gould's Cultural Apologetics. And so he begins that book, and Paul Gould is a professor in Florida. The name of his institution escapes me right now, but it's the same place as that Paul Copan is there as well. Maybe we can possibly look that up for you. But anyway, he is a professor. You have at your disposal internets as well, so you can look up where he is. But cultural apologetics begins by defining the terms. Always helpful to do. Paul Gould defines cultural apologetics as the effort to establish the Christian voice, conscience, and imagination in the culture so that the gospel is seen as attractive and true, and people are drawn to it. And he then goes on to say that Christianity has an image problem. And he draws a comparison to the fast food chain McDonald's. You remember when Super Size Me came out, Nathan?
Yeah. And then there's Super Size Me 2 as well.
That created a
PR
nightmare.
Keeps on going.
Yeah, correct. So that was a PR nightmare for McDonald's. And Gould argues that we as Christians in North America, particularly those of us who care about apologetics, have a similar problem on our hands. That is, we have an image problem. The church has a reputation for being anti-intellectual, being legalistic, and the list goes on. Now, moral hypocrisy, all of that. So what needs to happen is that we need to fix that image problem, and then people will be drawn to it. In some ways, Nathan, I think a title that always captured this really well, and this is a book worth reading too, is Philip Yancey's The Jesus I Never Knew. And Philip Yancey grew up in a church that unfortunately kind of modeled many of those negatives we just named. It was a legalistic church, racist as well. He's written about this quite a lot in his new memoir also. But so for him, when he had an actual encounter with Jesus Christ, it was a profoundly beautiful and liberating experience for him. But the question I want to pose for our listeners right now is, what if people aren't rejecting today the Jesus they never knew? What if they are rejecting Jesus? If we're in a moment that is anti-Christian, then I think image problem doesn't go far enough.
So I asked somebody
not really describing where we're at.
Yeah, I asked somebody this who is a good friend of ours who's in a PhD program and talking about the wide variety of friends that they have and perceptions of people finding out that she's Christian and kind of being shocked about it. And I asked her that. I said, "Do you think it's because
Mhm.
people don't know what Christianity is, or they do know what it is and they think it's bad?" And she said she thought it was kind of in a 60-40 split there, where some of it is due to
Mhm.
ignorance, but then a significant chunk of it is still they do understand it, but think that it's bad. And we got into this as a recap when we talked about the He Gets Us campaign, because the He Gets Us campaign is fully in that category of saying it's just an image problem, it's just a marketing problem. If people really knew, um, I think two things. I think what makes the conversation difficult is that we're right in between those. So there is still a portion of the population who does not know what the gospel is actually about, and is rejecting it based off of
Mhm.
ignorance. I've said it's kind of like, the atheist going up to the pine tree looking for apples, finding no apples, and then rejecting the category of fruit. Like, well, you wouldn't expect to find apples on a pine tree. Like, you're looking for the
Sure.
wrong thing in the wrong category. And therefore, your rejection of it is totally simplistic and underinformed. There's that side of it. But I think the where we're headed quickly and where you're leading us in this conversation is say, yeah, but what about all the people who grew up in the church, who do understand the gospel, who do um, have a handle on the things that Jesus taught and are rejecting that? We can't just sweep that under the rug, because that is going to, with some speed, become another significant portion, if it isn't already, of the world that we live in here in North America specifically.
Well, and so if you let's just run a little thought experiment here, Nathan. So let's say, okay, Christianity does indeed have an image problem. That's really what we have to deal with. I want to give you two reasons why I think this leads us in the wrong direction, to take that as our starting point. So the first is, if you think Christianity has an image problem, you are going to be obliged to constantly answer to all of these ridiculous accusations that are thrown at Christians, which will basically result in us it does result often in us chasing our tails. And we're constantly going to be saying, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. I'm not a Christian nationalist. I'm not bigoted. I'm not a sexist. I'm not xenophobic. I'm not racist. I care about all these people. And we're defining ourselves by what we're not. And we're not really ever getting to the place where we say, no, this is who we are in Christ. And by the way, who you are in Christ, we'll talk about this a little bit more, and this is the reason a lot of people are rejecting Jesus, not the Jesus they never knew, is because Jesus is always culturally iconoclastic. Iconoclasm means the one who smashes idols. In the central idols of our day, many of them have to do with sexuality and identity. And yes, Jesus stands in direct opposition to all of our cultural idols that happen to be the idols of a given time, and he's in opposition to the ones that we have now and that we cherish. People will sometimes say, nothing's sacred anymore. Absolutely untrue. There are always things that are sacred. Human beings can't live without sacred categories. Our sacred categories revolve here, at least in North America and the West, really at large. They all revolve around self-expression and identity and sexuality. I mean, if you question somebody's sexual expression, you will see that's a sacred cow right now.
Well,
You
it's
will
also
quickly see yourself as a transgressor.
yeah, and it's also helpful to see that the biggest conflicts that you see culturally and socially and politically are when visions of the sacred collide. So I'll give you an example.
Yes.
Imagine this: stand up on a chair at your university in the lunchroom and shout, "I believe people should only have sex with people they're married to and shouldn't kill their babies," and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Right. Yep.
you're taking your vision of sacred and dumping it into an atmosphere where another vision of sacred is at play, and you can only get sparks out of that.
Yes, and I think people, and just to kind of do the sympathetic, or just
I'm
do our
not
due
saying anybody
diligence
should
here.
actually do
A
that.
lot
I'm
of
using
people
that as a
would
thought
say,
experiment, just to be clear. I don't think that would be helpful. I'm just
"Hey, yeah,
throwing it out there.
take note. Do not do this. Do not try this at home or in your school." But no, I mean, I think when people say there is nothing sacred, what they mean is that we live in a very profane culture, and we do. That's absolutely true. But what do we mean by that? We need to be clear. What when I say we live in a very profane culture, I mean that as a Christian, what I think is we're taking things that actually are sacred and desecrating them and either making a mockery of them or vandalizing them. So the name of God, for instance, like virtually anything to do with traditional Christianity, it's a subject of constant derision and mockery in popular culture. It's been that way for a long time. But also marriage, a committed relationship. Nathan, we would as Christians say that the way looking at sex as just nothing more than a casual pastime is a profoundly profane act, because sex is sacred and it has a purpose and it's got an author. So profane is very much your categories are going to very much be determined by where you stand. And those of us who are Christians, we stand in the church, we're going to see a good deal of what our culture is doing as profane, because our culture is in the process of tearing apart all of its Christian heritage. And and for a long time
but that's not because of a lack of understanding of Christianity. That's because they're worshiping something else. And that's what makes cultural apologetics different, is that it's a different form of worship, I guess one of the way. Do you think people think there's like neutral territory here where you're kind of like in between two things, where Jesus is like, you're either with me or you're against me?
Yes, I think people do, because I've met them. And I'm trying to talk this through. And we've had a lot of really great thinkers over the years, I think, successfully explode the notion that any human being stands on any kind of neutral territory ever. And the person we love to quote often here, Nathan, is Charles Taylor. He shows this very, very well. I mean, all of us have very serious and commitments, and we're deeply invested in a vision of reality. That's everybody. That's not just Christians by any means. And there is no way to divest yourself of all of your deepest commitments, because that's the ground on which you stand. So yeah, there is no neutral territory in that sense. But we also need to recognize, and I think, I'm ahead of myself here a little bit, but this is just really important to say. So we'll get to say it again later. I think we're in a position now. Well, let's bring in Aaron Renn's categories again, just to help us out here a little bit. Remember, Aaron Renn, 3 phases of evangelicalism. It's really 3 phases of the reception to Christianity and American culture that he's talking about. And they are pretty much what they sound like: the positive, the neutral, and the negative. The positive, a better word for this than the positive, is so prosaic sounding, is really that's Christendom he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the day where Christianity is seen, it's respected, it's seen as something good for society. In some cases, there was a time where it was difficult to qualify for a loan from a bank if you didn't belong to a church. That's almost unimaginable. I think that pretty much is unimaginable today. If you told that to young people today, that was, what does that got to do with anything? And actually, I would say, well, it actually has a whole lot to do with stuff. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, to see somebody who's a member of a church as probably, I would say that is a note in favor of their character, their honesty, and all that. So that's a weird thing to say, but
something might be a positive thing.
Your ability to commit something. Yeah. And what is what the church stands for? This is a person who probably venerates the 10 Commandments. These are cornerstones of Western civilization. Well, we don't see it like that anymore. So then we go into the neutral phase, where this is the 1990s, according to Aaron Renn. I think he's probably right about that. Around that time, jury's out on Christianity. Remains to be seen whether it's good. People are open to persuasion. Universities have their doors open for dialogue and debate and all of that. But then we move to 2015. He dates that there because of the Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. And then we move to a different phase, the negative phase. I'm going to go stronger than Aaron Renn. I'm going to call it the anti-Christian phase, where America is complicated because we're a big, diverse country, very divided. So there are plenty of pockets in America where Christians are still respected and where it does pay dividends to be a member of a church, by the way. But what I mean by anti-Christian is that most of the there's consensus pretty much among our cultural elites now that Christianity is socially harmful and bad for the individual and bad for society. And it's therefore to be resisted and pushed out of influential places and arenas. And we do see that happening now. Doors are being slammed over and over again. One example that I think is worth giving here, Nathan, and I want to bring him up a little bit more in this because I think the tide has turned a little bit with some Christians against Tim Keller, and now he's suddenly not cool in some circles, and I think that's just silly because Tim Keller was fantastic.
Tell us how you
and
really
what he did
feel.
was great. Yeah. But yeah, and he was ahead of the curve on all of this, as I want to bring up in a second. But do you remember? It was 2017. I don't know if you remember this, Nathan. Do you remember when he was nominated for the Abraham Kuyper Award at Princeton University?
Mm-hmm.
This was hugely ironic, by the way, because he's invited. He's to receive this award. Then his views on female ordination and sexuality stirred controversy. So then the reward was rescinded. He was still allowed to give the lecture. Now, what's ironic about that is that the award is named for Abraham Kuyper, who shared Keller's views on both female ordination and sexual ethics. So, I mean, it's just it shows you how bizarre, what a bizarre world we live in. But that was a sign of a turning of the tide of doors now being closed, because a Tim Keller in the neutral world was a person who gave a talk at Google, right? And these doors were open to him. And then you started to see them slamming, and they've been slamming louder and louder ever since. So it's now important that we recognize, as apologists, especially when we talk to the culture at large, we have to speak from the church to the culture. So there's that neutral ground thing. There's no neutral ground. We are speaking from the church to the culture. We are absolutely not speaking from the culture to the church. The culture's lens is warped. Its categories are all wrong. Are we saying this in a discriminatory, insulting fashion? No. We are just being intellectually honest about the fact that we are Christians, and therefore we believe the Christian vision of reality structures the way we see the world. The world itself is not the proper vision of reality, and we're going to be honest about how we see it. So if we try to use the culture's categories, if we try to meet the culture on its own terms, it's a losing battle. And that's where we need to reconsider.
But this is not a throw your hands up on cultural engagement. It's saying we need to be very careful and make sure that we're defining the terms of relevance in the deep existential questions of humanity, not in the modern zeitgeist. Because what happens is, if you're trying to be, I've said it a lot of times, there's a fine line between being relevant and being ridiculous. And when the church chases modern relevancy, it's always like 3 years behind, and it just seems a little cringe. So it's like, if you're looking at the questions of what does it mean to be human? Who am I? How do I fit in? Why am I here? How should I behave? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Christianity is giving very, very, very thoughtful, deep, robust, helpful answers to those types of questions that I would say are perennially relevant to the human experience. What Cameron's talking about here is I don't even want to try to guess what's in Cameron's mind on this one, but a more shallow, oh, hey, we're just going to have the right coffee and climbing wall, and then everybody will think the church is cool. That kind of,
Well, let's give some pertinent examples, because that'll be helpful in clarifying this a little bit. Think about, so I'm going to come back. I said I would tell you 2 reasons why I think the image problem thing doesn't work.
Oh yeah. All right.
So I'll give you the second one here in a second, and then I'll bring in a few examples. Yeah. So the number one is we're just going to waste time trying to constantly appease our cultural critics. I always think of the great liberal Protestant theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher here. There's a beautiful name, Schleiermacher. But remember, I mean, I'm sure you talked about this when you were at Gordon Conwell, Nathan. I mean, his stated aim was to reach Christianity's cultured despisers. But in the process, he ended up getting seduced by Christianity's cultured despisers. That happens a lot, by the way.
Well, so hey, can I give a 1A?
Yeah,
I put a subcategory there. So you're saying it's a waste of time, but the Schleiermacher example
Yeah.
is that the church has, how many institutions have said we're going to go out there and influence the culture and been influenced by the culture in the process? So how in the world do you
Right.
not become influenced
Correct.
by we're going to go to DC and set up a Christian lobby to combat
Yep.
corruption, and then you're 5 years later, you're like, oh, where have we seen this before? So it's like, not only is it sometimes a waste of time, which I think there's a pearls before swine quote somebody should have come up with there. Oftentimes it becomes a greater temptation
Yeah.
to the, anyway, that's part B of your number one.
Yep. No, you're right. No, that's it. And so the first problem is we waste time with constantly trying to appease. But the second is we move from appeasement then to capitulation. That's the other big temptation here. So if the appeasement thing isn't working, you can't you haven't been able to persuade your opponents that you're really not a racist, you're really not a bigot, you're really not homophobic, whatever slur gets thrown your way, you're really not a Christian nationalist. You took a page out in a newspaper saying that you're not, and it's still not working. Well, then the second stage is you start to adapt the gospel. You start to change it. You start to mess with it in order to capitulate to the zeitgeist. So I'm going to get the example I'm going to give here. We just have to be clear, Nathan. This isn't in the interest of finger pointing. This is in the interest of clarity. So the unconditional conference that Andy Stanley put on, this was critiqued by our friend, by the way, Sam Albury, in the pages of Christianity Today. Why? Because it sent profoundly mixed signals on a very important question. It's a key cultural idol right now, having to do with sexual expression. So in this case, the issue of homosexuality. And by not taking a clear stand and also putting people on the roster who self-identify as practicing gay Christians, people like Justin Taylor, the best they can draw from that is a note of ambiguity, or they can conclude that you are quietly giving a plug to being affirmative. But the problem is, if you have a church that's built on a model of cultural engagement that has to do with meeting the culture on its own terms, you're in a world that's not neutral anymore, where there isn't that you're not seen in good faith by your cultural opponents. It's going to require more and more compromise. That's what has to happen. And so this is why the image problem thing isn't going to work anymore. I think you could in a Christendom moment, you could in a neutral moment. You can't now. It won't work anymore.
So I don't appreciate the snarkiness of the Babylon Bee on political things, but every once in a while they have a headline that is legitimately funny. And during the time of that conference is also when like the Stanley, like the mug thermos company was exploding, and there's this whole big thing about the Stanley tumbler. And so Babylon Bee ran a title of Stanley introduces the Andy Stanley tumbler, which keeps your beverages at a lukewarm temperature. As a shot at that kind of thing that you're saying. It's fascinating how fast people pick up on that, and nobody's actually pleased. Like, you end up making both sides mad by trying to be ambiguous enough to appeal to both. And so there's that lukewarmness there.
Yeah. Just like the He Gets Us ad that you brought up.
Sometimes, yeah. It does double duty in unhelpful directions. Are we?
So let's
hang on before we go on, because we have ourselves said in the past, hey, we want to be careful and thoughtful and respectful of the way that other people are doing ministry, and to not speak ill of the church or other people who are doing the work of the Lord. We don't want to second guess people's motives. We don't want to, I think we have a reputation and a tone in the way that we approach the world in our faith, and then that's displayed in the conversations we have with each other, that tries to be respectful there. So we aren't trying to jump on anybody's heads in this conversation. We're just saying, let's think through whether or not the adventure that we sometimes begin is actually helpful for what we're trying to accomplish, and recognize the changing tides in the landscape in which we live, of whether or not some of the ways in which we've done cultural apologetics in the past is really the same as it is now. So that's I think we have to use specific examples, but the intent here is not to justify ourselves. It's to help us all think strategically through what the best way forward is.
And the temperature in the room has changed. I think a lot of people know that. And so we need to more and more. I mean, people recognize this, like you said, Nathan. The Babylon Bee article. This is it's speaking for a lot of people here. That's why it was seen as funny. Things have changed, and so I think there's lots of recognition in the church that we've got to re-strategize. We have to rethink our efforts right now because the cultural landscape has changed so dramatically. We talk often about social acceleration, which just means that these social trends are moving at such a rapid pace. And right now, what we're drawing attention to is that shift involves more and more of an anti-Christian edge. And so how do we think about our ministry? How do we think about cultural apologetics in light of an anti-Christian culture? And this is nothing new. The church has faced anti-Christian cultures since its inception. So we have some great examples to look to in the Word of God. And that's one of the reasons why I think Nathan and I have always stressed in thinking out loud over the years that you want your feet firmly planted in the church, because Christ, his word, and his people are all you need to meet the challenges of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's all you need. You don't need anything more than that. You really don't. So what is cultural apologetics? Let's just define terms again, just real carefully, because I think it's just real quickly, it'll be helpful as we move forward here a little bit. But apologetics, I think, is just, some people would say it's the art and science of Christian persuasion. That's fine so far as it goes. I like that definition. I also like to say it's articulacy about your relationship with Christ. I like to say it like that because there's a tendency nowadays, since apologetics is a full-fledged academic field. You can do master's and PhD work in apologetics. I did my master's in apologetics. There's this notion that you're supposed to be a professional or an academic in order to do it, and that's not true. We're all called to give a defense for the hope that is within us. And so, if we're talking about the most crucial and important relationship in our life, yeah, we can all do that. So, apologetics includes the academy, but it's not limited to it. I think that's important to point out. So, articulacy about one's faith in Christ. That's apologetics. Cultural apologetics does not change the definition. It just adds in an element of location, I think. So it's articulacy about your relationship with Christ, where at the intersection of the church and the wider culture. But once again, it's really important that we have our feet planted in the church, not in the culture. The church is going to define our terms, define it. That's where we get our categories. That's our vision of life and reality as it is. And we evaluate the world, its poets, its songwriters, its filmmakers, its comedians, all of that in light of what we know from Christ and his word. We don't allow their categories to structure our belief. That's the danger in cultural apologetics, is to get sucked into that cultural world and have that be our primary lens rather than Christ, his word, and his people.
Yeah. And you see this in Charles Taylor and others critiquing, where they would say, if you move from Yahweh to creator in order to have a discussion about origins, or you're making these subtle shifts where you're taking what you really believe and making it slightly more ambiguous in order to make it philosophically palatable to the people who have questions in those categories. There is, I think, a sense in which you're like, well, that's just being, we're kind of interpreting our own belief in order to make it accessible and translate it to. And he's like, yeah, maybe. Or maybe you're watering down what you actually believe and think is true in order to try. And then at some point, it just becomes ridiculous because nobody knows what you're talking about. And the ambiguity and vagueness doesn't help anyone. And so that is the consistent temptation there.
Well, and the example I like to point to here is Paul at the Areopagus, which is, that's an apologetic hallmark. Everybody loves that passage. But so what he could do is he points to the altar to the unknown God. I think the temptation for us is to just linger and loiter. I think I've said this before, at the altar to the unknown God. Because, people have a deep-seated spiritual, yearning. Everybody does. And there's this impulse to worship. Nathan, you were just talking about that earlier. Yeah, everybody worships. We all do that. And you can get people I mean, people will recognize that. It's not hard to convince people that what they're doing at an Ariana Grande concert, or, oh my goodness, Taylor Swift. I mean, this Eras tour thing has just hit Disney Channel, and now I have very mixed emotions as I watch my little girl watching this. Yeah, but it's not hard to convince people this this a worship experience for many people who are weeping in the audience and all that. And so people will go along with you. Yes, absolutely. Oh, it's very spiritual. Taylor Swift is so spiritual. It's very spiritual. And just stay there. But that's not helping anybody. Paul doesn't stay there. What does he do? He starts talking about Jesus Christ, and he talks about him rising from the dead. And then people do what people do. Some of them think it's really interesting, and some of them are like, what on earth are you talking about? Are you crazy? Rising from the dead. And there are some people who look at that passage and say, well, he failed. This was a failed message. It was a failed sermon. No, it wasn't. This is always what happens when you get specific. And so, don't linger at the altar to the unknown God. You've got to go to the known God, though. Eventually, you can point to those yearnings. Absolutely.
A couple of years ago, there was a tragedy, and young person in the school system died, and they wanted my dad to have the funeral during the school day in the gym. And the Board of Education said, you can do it, but you can't do it specifically as a Christian. And my dad said, I am not a representative of Mickey Mouse. Man. I am a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he did it, and a couple of teachers read scripture and sang hymns. But it's just that kind of thing where you would say, oh, wow, this is an opportunity to be in front of the, and you're like, no, it's not worth it if I can't be what I actually am. And so I thought that was.
Well, what have you actually accomplished if you just go up there and give some benign or ambiguous
milquetoast
message? Yeah. I mean, who does that help? I mean, it's worth asking. I mean, we want to make sure doors are open. Doors are open so you can essentially say nothing. We need to think really long and hard about that. And plus, I mean, we don't always, some doors need to slam shut. The real important thing is your neighbor. It's not the big influential corridors or the conferences. It's your neighbor. It's the people around you. So let's bring Tim Keller back in, because I said
get Tim in here.
I think what he did he was fantastic. So toward the end of his ministry, and indeed toward the end of his life, in 2018, he did a missions conference in Chicago for 2 days, and he gave an outstanding 2-part lecture there. And one of the things he said was, I worry that today's apologists are conceding too much to the culture. He basically said, what we're saying, the culture's terms are all wrong. He said, what we need to do in a post-Christendom society, such as what's happening to us right now, he didn't say it was here yet. He said it's happening. What we need to do is we need a high theory of culture. That means we critique culture. And how do we do that? We have to expose idols. And the example he gives here is Augustine's City of God. That's the greatest high theory of culture that the church has right there. And it's a scathing, powerful, beautiful, compassionate, but firm indictment of pagan society. And basically saying this, your beliefs, your structure, your assumptions don't work. Your society doesn't flourish under these conditions. We have to do the same thing. So
he wrote that. He wrote that in the context of the barbarians sacking Rome,
a falling Roman Empire.
I mean, if you want cultural change and upheaval, and the barbarians are at the gate and crossing, that was the context.
It's a bit on the nose. Yeah. So I mean, but that's what we have to do. That's the task of cultural apologetics right now is twofold. It's exposing idols, but then offering Christ as the answer, showing people Christ as the answer. That's what we have to do now and exposing idols, Nathan, is a thankless task, especially today. People are not going to clap you on the back and say, oh, gee, thanks for telling me that all the things I care about the most are hollow. I mean, and lest we get all high and mighty about it, think about how you feel when your idols are exposed. I mean, I don't handle it so well myself. So, I mean, we need a note of real compassion here as we do this. But
I have an uneasiness, which is this, that many of the, I'll just say it honestly, it's not probably the right, many of the things that I attribute to kind of what I would consider cringe visions of Christian cultural engagement are done in a style of, hey, look at us being Christian in public. And that's not, I think, what you're saying. Does that make sense? Of, well, I'm not listening to
No,
anybody
you
else. I'm
gotta
just standing alone on
expound
the
on
word
it.
of God. I'm going to get out here on the fountain in this university and tell everybody the truth like it actually is. And I know that I'm at odds with everybody
Yes.
else, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
standing on this, and I'm not trying to capitulate or have a conversation. And I'm
Yeah, sure.
a whole lot of I gets embedded in there somehow, where we end
Oh,
up
of course. Yeah, no,
making an
that's helpful.
identity out
Mm-hmm.
of that distinction for ourselves that actually isn't about the proclamation and the
Yeah.
promulgation. Yeah.
So this can
Say something to that.
harden. Yeah, well, this can harden into. There are a couple of different things that go wrong if this isn't balanced out with love. If the motivation isn't love for God and neighbor, this can turn into, you can become a culture warrior type, where
Mhm.
you just go after people, and then your motivations are much more political than they are theological there. You can also basically become a legalist and just talk to yourself. I mean, the person who stands up on a soapbox at, University of California, Berkeley, and screams that homosexuals and trans people are going to hell, who's he really talking to? He's knocking this off the list. He might say he's being brave and courageous, but he's essentially just talking to himself. He's not actually. If we actually want to talk to human beings, the motivation has to be love. What I'm calling for, or what we're calling for here, and a lot of other Christians and Tim Keller and others, is not to match hostility of the culture or anything like that.
Mhm.
We're calling for intellectual honesty in speaking with people. We have to be upfront about who we are. And I think, Nathan, this is a whole separate podcast, but I think the greatest apologetic question of our day is, who am I? I'm just going to put that out there.
Mhm.
The whole question of what it means to be human, the greatest question people are asking in our culture, and it's a signal of how incredibly mixed up and confused we are. Who am I?
Yeah.
It is in some ways a profound question. It's also a teenager's question. I mean, we just can't overlook
Mhm.
that. This
Mhm.
is a very adolescent question. You know, but that's the biggest question in our culture. That's the biggest apologetic question. So we need to be, the answer to that is, I mean, we are Christ's ambassadors and witnesses. People have to, so what they're going to have to see is Christ in us. It's no longer us who live, but Christ in us. People have to see that. And the only way they're going to see that is if there's genuine love there in what you're doing. And your motivation is genuine love. But we have to be intellectually honest about where we stand. And we have to be clear on who defines our categories and who gives to us our vision of reality. It's not
Okay.
the cultural lens we think is wrong. But we want
As
to,
we
but we're still, I believe it. I believe in winsomeness. I believe in persuasion. I don't think winsomeness is bad. I don't think persuasion is bad. I'm all for them. So, yeah, just put that
let
out there.
let me this is going to get awkward and difficult in a hurry, but let me propose that if you're curious about where you stand on this, that some of that can be highlighted for you in your commitments with your time. So you said we need to speak from the church to the culture, not from the culture to the church, or from the culture to the culture, from the church to the church, I guess. But if we're
Right.
speaking from the church to the culture, the way in which we manifest where we're getting our dictates from shows up with the commitments that we have of what we do with our time. And it's interesting to me that, and for those of you, somebody was just saying this to me this week. It's wild. I don't know. Are your kids doing sports yet, Cameron? But it's like mandatory basketball meeting Wednesday
They
night.
are,
Everybody
yes.
has to be there, or you can't be on the team. Like the time commitment and expectation that people have toward third grade soccer is phenomenal and is much more significant than
Yep.
most people have toward church. And so I think one of the ways in which we start looking at how do we have a distinctive idea in our own minds of where our feet firmly situated is we say, we can't do that. We have a prior commitment to something that's bigger and more important in our lives. And so what you say no to in order to say yes to the things of the church does become far more than just, oh, I think this will be fun. It does to some ways shape and form your interior being of what am I willing to compromise on in my worship experiences in order for myself to have these other opportunities or in order for my kids to have these other opportunities. And then all of a sudden you quickly, well, it's not that big, well, um, just worth thinking through. If I want to do a little meddling in my own
Hmm.
life here and spread it out to you guys as well. So, how do you know what camp you're firmly rooted in? Is the ease with which you will forfeit your prior commitments in order to accommodate and do something else. And I'm just picking on kids' sports here because it's fresh in my mind from a conversation. But all of us have those things in our lives where what are the easy things to forfeit for you? And that helps us have some indication of whether or not we're firmly established in the categories that we think we actually are.
Mm. No, that's a good word. And so, why did I call this offensive apologetics? Well, for one, I just thought I'd indulge in a clickbait title, which I don't usually do. So that was fun to do. Gotcha. But also because the move from trying to appease cultural critics, which has been a big maneuver for a lot of Christian cultural engagement for a while, actually, because Christian cultural engagement was, I think, predicated on a model where cultural influence was really cherished and prized.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was, but I think moving from that to exposing idols that's the offensive maneuver, offensive in the technical sense of that term, moving away from being constantly on the defensive and wasting our breath constantly defending ourselves against charges, most of which are frankly just ridiculous and completely untrue. There will be contexts in which we do meet those challenges and give answers, but moving from that to the exposing of idols involves us saying, how is that working for you? And there,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we can end on this note. We are at a time of great societal upheaval, but people are really struggling. For all of our, ideas about identity and freedom and, how enlightened we are just falling apart behind the scenes. I mean, I can't go to any university. I know this is the same for you, Nathan, without hearing about not that suicide is a problem, but oh no, we just had a funeral in this very space last week for a
Mm-hmm.
student,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
a little bit ago there was another one for a student. I mean, these are signs that things are not working. They have gone
Mm-hmm.
profoundly wrong. It's not working, and so offensive, not in the sense of causing outrage and being being a nuisance to people, but in the sense of saying this isn't working. We
You
have
know,
an answer,
yeah.
and
You
his
know,
name is Christ.
yeah. Let me put a story on this. A few years back, my brother was involved in a situation where in the school system where a young man was suicidal. So the police were called. That wasn't helping. They got all the counselors. That wasn't helping. The mental health professional not helping. Everybody was beside themselves. And finally, he just stepped in and said, "Hey, can I talk to this guy for a few minutes together? One on one." He's like, "Here's the problem with your life." And they had a little chat. Um, and that guy was later baptized in our church. But it was just one of those
Mm.
moments where it's like all of the other resources were not doing anything helpful in that conversation, in that situation. And I think that is the sense that we have as a world of like everybody is flailing around, knows there's a problem, and our best laid plans are not doing anything. And sometimes you just need the church to show up and be like, you were made in the image of God to have a relationship with God, and your life is miserable until you get that sorted out. And you are meant for connection with other people. And the problem in your life is sin, and you can be forgiven of it. And that's not out of the blue. It's based off of pre-existing relationships and relationships of trust. But every once in a while, you just got to call a spade a spade. And I think that's the offensive part of what Cameron is saying here is like, don't act like what you believe is irrelevant to the deep desires of humanity, but also don't act like what's relevant to the passing fads of our time has a significant impact and outcome on the church and what you believe. And so it's a one-way street on some of these things. We have a lot to give to the world, and let's not forfeit that for silly reasons or slack back from it from our own cowardice. And I think there are times in my life, Cameron, where I've been cautious of that. I think praying for boldness of Lord, what do you want me to say? And when do you want me to be quiet? Is a real category of discernment that we all really, really, really need to lean into in this time. And so if there's a practical takeaway, I think from this, I'm trying to like really lean into what Cameron's been saying here and think, what do I want to do as a result? And I think it's to have that discernment of when do I need to be bold and say, hey, here's what I think the problem is. And when do I need to be silent and not care what people think about something? That's the task ahead of us. And we can't draw happy little trendy lines for you there. It's just something you're going to have to work out with between you and the Lord. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.